Hi folks, this is a video for the NEC Bassoon Studio made in 2020 on processing cane. And by processing I mean the drudgery work of making cane from scratch up to a shaped and profiled piece of cane. And I'm going to use my equipment, which is similar to the NEC equipment, and hopefully we'll cover some points that all of you should know before you use our excellent, finely tuned, and thus far, over several years, well cared for machines. So the reason why it's good to do your own gouging and shaping and profiling, well, the main reason is it's a lot cheaper. and that's important because the main resource that we spend in making a reed is time, and when you spend the other main resource, money, you end up spending a lot of time on cane that you should otherwise just put aside, or maybe even throw away, or maybe even burn in some kind of sacrificial rite. But if you buy tube cane and you prepare it yourself, you can select just the best stuff and start with that, and it's still going to be 10 times cheaper than buying well prepared cane. The other reason is when you do it yourself, it gives you a little bit more control over what you're doing. If you prefer a slightly thicker or thinner gouge, or one that's more eccentric, one that tapers to the sides a little bit more or less, you can play with those parameters, and you can get something that's more suited to what you like. So the very first thing is splitting the cane, selecting pieces out of the tube cane. You buy these tubes from various cane suppliers. This particular bunch is from Charles Reed, and I've gotten it from RDG, and I'm sure if you Google, you can find, I have a supply that's basically all mixed up at this point. And the first thing we want to do is we want to select pieces out of this tube. So you want a piece that's straight and also of consistent diameter. This particular tube is quite uneven, and I selected it for that particular purpose. So what you want to do is make sure that when you split the cane, you're getting at least one piece out of it that is a consistent diameter within that one piece. So you don't want the one piece to incorporate a curved part and then another part that's a little bit straighter. So I look at the bottom of the tube and I split it. I use this particular device, which has 4 blades in it. Some people use arrowheads. There are other various splitters, and some people use just a utility knife. And what the utility knife is particularly good for is you can really just take out exactly the piece of cane that is exactly right looking. It's not crooked, it's straight on this side. We hold it up to the light and see how crooked it is. On this particular one is quite straight. Now we only need 120 millimeters of straight, so if it's a little bit sloped up one end, it's not going to particularly matter. Anyway, so if you're using a utility knife, It's you just put it on the floor, and it cracks fairly easily. You just kind of pound it in there and just give it a little twist like that. Watch your fingers, of course, and then there I have a split down there, and I can see right here there'll be another piece of cane that I'll be able to glean from this, and again I just kind of twist it back and forth and it splits out. So that's a piece of cane. If I'm using this splitter, this is super easy. I'll look at the bottom piece of the cane and try to line the blades up with at least one or two pieces that are of a consistent diameter, and I give it a little tap like that, and it splits it into 4. Super easy. And this one has this tube, actually. It has a nice function. It kind of contains it while it's I split it. I think the school one is just a 4-blade splitter, and you just tap it down into the cane. So now the next thing I do is we have to guillotine. We have to cut this cane into 120 millimeter pieces, and on the gouging machine you have this guillotine here. Looks like a cigar chopper or a guillotine, but it's not for violent purposes. And you want to select 120 millimeters of a cane that is as straight as possible. If it's a little crooked on the ends, it's not necessarily a disaster. Really, the blade itself is only about 30 millimeters, so it's just in the middle of the cane. So if that part is straight and the cane is otherwise maybe a terrific piece of cane, maybe you'll get a read out of it. But right here, there's a sort of a curve in this particular piece. So I'll try to cut 120 millimeters of the straightest stuff, both straight this way and straight this way. To test the straightness this way, I put it against the ruler, and I make sure it's not bowed or curved in either direction. So you always do 2 chops. This end over here is actually the crooked part, and this is fine, but I'm just going to give a little chop at the end of this, and then like that. And now I place it in the guillotine. There is a stopper at the end of the guillotine. I open up the blade, place it in the stopper, and then chop down. Now at this point, the cane is dry. I would ordinarily soak it after I've split it. You split it dry, then you soak it, then you do all these next processes that I'm going to show you with the cane fully soaked. All right, so now we have a piece of cane that is reasonably straight this way and reasonably straight this way and that way, and it is ready to pre-gouge. Now before I go to the pre-gouger, and at every stage I make sure that the blades that I've been using are dried and oiled using, this is baby oil, it's mineral oil with a little bit of scent in it, which you don't need, you just use mineral oil, but that's just what I bought. So you wipe off the blade, both the blade and the thing that the blade is cutting against. It's very hard steel, and it's not very receptive. It's not very, water doesn't treat it kindly. I would actually push out the little pin here and pull the whole blade out and dry it off, and including the stuff that's in the channel there. Wipe it all off, take a little bit of baby oil on a Kleenex or paper towel, that's more than a little bit, and wipe down the blades. And if you have a piece of Kleenex or cotton or something like that, it's not a bad idea to just take a very thin little piece of the paper, and actually that's soaked in oil, and have it kind of close down on the paper there a little bit, and that keeps the blade from rusting, because these blades are very difficult to sharpen. The guillotine blade, less important than all the other blades on the other machines, but still, it's nice to keep. Now the next step is pretty quick. This is a Pre-Gouger. It has two blades in it and a device that shoves the cane into the blade. You have one blade that kind of starts it, and then another curved blade back here that finishes doing some of the gouging work for you. It's really simple. You just place the cane down here. Now this particular piece of cane is quite curved and is not going to fit in there. I'll start with this piece, and you just line it up with your fingers so it's centered in the channel, and then you crank it through until the crank hits the crank post hits the little ball bearing there, and then you stop and you put in another piece, and that first piece will just fall out. All right, so now I have one piece completely pre-gouged. It's a little bit of a thick gouge. I know some people who just set the pre-gouger to do a gouge itself. This is the discard stuff. Make sure you have the waste basket around. And then, all right, what do you do with the last piece? Well, the last piece, you need something to shove in there. So you take a little piece of cane, you need something to shove it out completely. So I have a little piece of cane there, and hopefully it'll get it all the way through, which it did. Now we have to be able to pull out this last piece of cane, which I will wedge out with this blade here. Now, these blades are attached with Allen wrenches on my machine. I take them off, wipe them off completely. Both blades, I take off this round blade and that blade, wipe off everything, wipe off the post, get it all completely dry, and again, take my baby oil and get the blades all nice and oiled so they don't rust, and that way they'll last a good long time and your colleagues can enjoy the machines too. So now we have some pre-gouged cane. What's the next step? My main thing when I'm making reeds is I'm trying to save time. I'm trying not to waste my time with bad cane. So before I spend some time on the gouging machine, I do a hardness test on the pre-gouged cane. It has to be completely dry. By the way, your cane is completely soaked when it's going through the pre-gouger. It should be soaked from the time after you split it. You can guillotine it dry, but it saves the blade a little bit of effort if the cane is softened up by being thoroughly soaked. And by soaked, a thick piece of cane, it really takes like 12 hours to soak it, at least. And while you're soaking it, if you're soaking up a big batch, make sure that you kind of give it a stir so that pieces of cane that are against one another, you're not going to get a lot of soaking. Like the bark is very hard to soak through, so kind of stir it up so that pieces of cane get all jumbled around, a couple times in the 12 hours. Don't soak it more than 12. And then later on, once the cane is completely gouged, you don't have to soak it for, basically you soak it until it sinks, which is, I don't know, 6 hours, 10 maybe. Soak it in the morning, and then in the evening you work on it. The hardness tester has an anvil that presses a consistent amount of pressure into the cane and measures how deeply it can press into it with that set amount of pressure. And obviously if it goes deeper, that's going to be a softer material. If it it doesn't go very deeply, that's going to be a harder material. This hardness tester and most of the machines you have and that I have are made by Reeds and Stuff, Udo Hing. This one, and hardness testers are designed, you have to get one for either a bassoon or an oboe because they're only designed for a certain thickness of material, and a pre-gouge piece of cane is a little bit too thick for it to fit in, at least in the middle. On the edges, it's kind of soft. And I give it a little testing. Put it on the edge. You zero in the needle, and then you pull this thing all the way over, and that pushes the anvil down. And this says that it is about 24. So that anvil has plunged in 0.24 millimeters into the cane. And that is quite soft by this particular hardness tester's measurements. The sweet spot is around 15.15 millimeters. I'm going to zero this piece in and see where I get. Okay, so this is a 20. I usually will keep, I'll make cane from anywhere from, well, 10 would be too hard. So let's say around 12 to 20, I'll proceed with actually gouging it. Okay, so that's a fairly quick process, and it saves your gouging machine blade and it saves you time in gouging. I wouldn't throw away pieces at any stage. Well, maybe the crooked pieces in the splitting stage, but I wouldn't throw away any pieces until you learn what works for you. Okay, so that was hardness tested dry. Now I soak it again, 12 hours. The gouging machine has the most critical blade of the machines at the school, and it's the easiest blade to ruin if the gouging machine isn't used properly. So I'm going to say this a couple of times. You see these metal clips at the end of the gouger, these things. These metal clips can do a lot of damage to the blade if the blade bumps into them. So when you put the carriage down to gouge, you never put it at the ends. You always place it down in the middle of the cane. You don't lift it up. As it goes back and forth, it pushes these pins back and forth and gets them out of the way. This area right here pushes that pin. Okay, if I lift it up, then when I put it down at the end, this blade is going to run into metal. And it doesn't like metal. Okay? So, you have this lever here, which lifts up this pin and also pushes back an element that will clamp the cane in. On the other side, you do it by hand, you lift this up, and there's a little metal piece at the end that just holds the cane, just so, in the thing. And you place the clip on like that, and then you press it in and make sure that the cane is in the center. All right. So the gouging blade will go from one end to the other and take a single peel of cane off. But I don't put it on the end, put it in the middle. I hold it down. Okay, now it's at the end and it's going to catch the end of the cane, and I bring it all the way to the end. And it takes off a peel all the way to the end. And again, I don't lift up this carriage, I keep it down. I'm pressing down into the cane while I'm doing it, and I draw it forward. And I do that until no cane comes up. Then I lift up this carriage, I lift up this clip, use this lever to lift up the other clip, and I turn the cane around. Put this clip back, make sure the cane is in the center. Put that lever back here. Put the carriage, middle of the cane. Draw it all the way back with a little bit of downward pressure, and then I draw it forward, and it takes off a whole peel. The blade is actually a little bit off center, tiny little bit. I'll explain why in a minute. Okay, so one scrape, and that's all it will take for the time being. I turn it around. Okay, center, pull these levers back, make sure it's nice and pinned in there. Put the carriage in the middle of the cane. Draw it back, pressing down a little bit, and then I draw the carriage forward. Look at that, takes off another piece. Okay, and I'm gonna flip it back and forth until it doesn't take off anything. Until this process is done. Always take these peels clear after every cutting. Let's see if I get anything on this last one. Okay, and I got nothing, so I'm done. And I'll measure it with my dial indicator. And in the center, the typical gouge is between 1.35, it could be as thin as 1.25, and could be as thick up to 1.5. In the middle. The reason why the blade is slightly off-centered is so that you get a somewhat eccentric gouge. You could have a blade that was exactly centered and was ground so that you get the eccentric gouge. An eccentric gouge means that the edges are a little bit thinner than the middle. The theory being that as the cane gets closer to the bark, it gets harder. If you have a concentric gouge, one that's a parallel, it's the same thickness all the way along, then the edges are of the reed are made of cane that's a little bit softer. It ends up being sort of dark and smooth and unresponsive and stuffy. If you have a gouge that's too eccentric with edges that are right close to the bark, then it makes it maybe very responsive, but kind of hard and a little bit brittle sounding. So there's a sweet spot there. Hopefully the machine in NEC is set like that. Okay, so now I dry the cane. By the way, when I dry the cane with the Pre-Gouger, and also when I dry the cane with this, I set the cane so that it's bark side up. It takes longer for the bark to dry than the pulp side to dry. And if you put it bark side down, the pulp side will dry way too soon and will shrink and will curl the cane up. If you put it bark side up, then it'll dry fairly evenly. Bark side will be slower because it's bark, but that'll be compensated for because it's on the outside. So both the outside and the inside will dry about the same rate and it won't curl up as much. All right, so I put my pieces of cane down in a nice row and dry them out completely, and then I do another hardness test on them. And now I'm very brutal about it. They have to be within, like, for me on my hardness tester, between 14 and 18. Outside that parameter, I've never gotten a read, so maybe I could possibly get a read at some point, and you should use everything. If you have a hardness tester, you should use everything and just kind of keep track of what works. And eventually you'll find if there's something outside of whatever works for you, then don't bother with it, at least as your first pieces of cane that you're progressing. Okay, so the next thing, after I've hardness tested it again, then I take my select pieces, soak them up, and I shape them. I like to shape before I profile, because there's less to profile. On a flat shaper, again, I soak the cane again. So this is a process that you do over a couple of days. I soak the cane again, around 12 hours, and I put it in the shaper, trying to center it in to the shaper. Clamp down on it. Of course, there's a curve that conforms to the curve of the cane. Don't put the cane in backwards. And the critical thing with shaping, whether you're doing it on a flat or a fold over, and I'll explain how to do it on a fold over after this. First of all, I use an X-Acto blade. I don't use a utility knife that's too thick and heavy. I don't use a razor blade that's too light and it gets destroyed. An X-Acto blade, I can take a couple of quick swipes on the sharpening stone as I'm going, and I don't have to go through a million blades at once. These sharpen extremely quickly. They don't have to be, super. You can shave the hair on your arms easily sharp, but I just find these little X-Acto blades the easiest thing. Okay, so it's a little bit dull. I'm gonna, from the previous bout, this is a diamond stone. Does a very quick job of it, and that's ready. Now, the critical thing with shaping is that you not go beyond the middle point seen in this above photograph with the red line. So if I go beyond the middle point, then the cane is going to crack into and beyond the shape itself. So I start in the middle. This shaper has a little, and the one at school I believe is the same, has a little V marking for the center. Don't bother with that, okay? Don't carve into that. I start in the middle and I bring my blade back, and at this point it's getting pretty close to the center, so I'm not going to go beyond that center line. From that center line, I'm going to turn the shaper around and I'm going to work up from the bottom up to that center line. And then I go down to the center line, not all the way down to the bottom of the cane, up to the center line, down to the center line, okay, until I can't take any material off, and then that one side is done. And I do that on all four sides. Open it up. Okay, I can profile it now. I don't have to dry it out, but if you want to just store it like this, you can store it forever. If you have a fold over shape, you're going to profile it before you shape, of course. I will get to that, but I'm going to profile using this shaped piece. It's going to be basically the same thing as if I profiled with an unshaped piece. Okay, so now we're going to do some profiling. A profiler is basically just a wood plane that is regulated. The depth of cut that it can go into the wood is regulated by various guides. The plane blade is another extremely fragile blade that's easily ruined. So please be careful with it after you use it. Baby oil, wipe off the blade, baby oil a little piece of paper, and kind of wedge it in there. Make sure that that's well cared for, and then your colleagues might also have good reeds, which hopefully you feel like is in your self-interest, because it's nice to play with good colleagues. All right, so usually the blade is a little bit oily from the previous users. So just wipe it off a bit. You have a couple of various gizmos on these. You have on these Udo hang machines. You have these two things, which are this is a center marker. There's a little circular blade under there, and this is a collar marker right here. And I think on the school machine, actually, these are in a slightly different position, but they look basically the same. You have to make sure that these things are down all the way, descending like this when you're using the main part of the profiler. You take off the easel from the machine, and you clamp the reed, obviously centered as well as you can, not the reed, the cane, soaked about 12 hours, or if you've already soaked it for shaping and it's ready to go. And you center it using the lines and markers and stuff that are on that easel, and then you clamp it down. This is it's not a precision machine, it's just a blade. It can dig in a little bit too far. It takes a little bit of finesse with your hand. If you're too aggressive with it, it will cut too deeply. If your touch is too light, it might not cut enough. But especially in the first couple of swipes that you're going to do, you can't be too aggressive, and you start on the side of the cane, almost off, like so. You're just this, as opposed to the Gouging machine. This you lift up the carriage, you place it down at the end, at the back end towards the tube, and you draw it forward on the edge of the cane, just so it takes off this tiniest amount. So it's only taking off cane right here. And I rotate it forward. Each time I'm lifting this carriage up, which you do not do on the Gouging machine, but you do it here. You lift the carriage up and place it down with a little bit of pressure. How much pressure? My guess is it's about 20 pounds. That might be completely inaccurate. Just enough to catch the cane. And you're just rotating a little bit so that the shave that you're taking off is maybe 2 millimeters wide. Okay. Alright, I'll go right to the off. I haven't used these cutters yet. Okay, just one cut. Then I do the second side. I do one cut, starting from the very edge, exactly the same way as the previous one. Okay, now I brought the second side to the level of this first side, so I can do two cuts. Second swipe on it, and now it's a smidge lower than the first side that I cut. Then I turn it around, and I can do two cuts in here. The first cut, bring it down so it's level with the side that I'm not cutting, and I do the second cut starting from the edge, always lifting up, placing down. Alright, so now I've done a couple swipes on this this machine. Now it's time to cut the collar. And in cutting the collar, it not only defines the collar in a nice way, it also, the blade of the profiler will catch that collar and you won't have a slope at the very back of the cane. So I've cut the collars, and now the blade is going to catch that collar area, and I go back and forth and back and forth. And on the other side, back and forth, until basically nothing is coming up. Okay, and the last cuts that you do, you can use the most pressure. You're not going to be digging the blade too far into the cane. You're only taking off little dust. So the last couple cuts you can press a little bit harder. And then the final thing you do before you take it off is you mark the center. Now, there's a little bit of slop in how this sits in the carriage, and the center of the cane is marked when you press the cane to one side or the other. And I'm not exactly sure how the NEC one is set. It's not a disaster if you put the center in the center score in the wrong place. You take this thing and you scoop it over and you push it down and rotate the cane. So try, it might be marked on the profiler which way you push this before you do the center mark. If it's not marked, try pushing it one way, put a center mark in, take the cane off the easel, fold it over, and see if you were correct. It should fold over pretty easily. And then the cane is now ready to turn into a blank, which is a whole other discussion. But we're not finished with this machine yet. What do we have to do? We have to wipe off all the blades. We have two blades here, and we wipe them off with a piece of paper towel or a tissue, and then you take your baby oil and you squeeze a little bit on the paper, and you baby oil that, baby oil this blade, and actually keep an oil-soaked piece of tissue in contact with the blade. Just kind of wrap it around like that. Okay, and then it will be ready for the next one. There are adjustments that you can do, that one can do to change where the collar is and the thickness and stuff like that. The school machine is set for a good general profile. If it seems like it's out, my phone number is on that machine. Give me a call. I'll adjust it. Please don't try to adjust the machines yourself. It can be a can of worms, and then it won't be adjusted for the next person. But if it's just not working for you, give me a call, and we'll discuss what needs to be done. And they get out of adjustment, and I can fix them up. So if you've profiled the cane unshaped, then you have to use a fold-over shaper, which I'll cover quickly. This fold-over shaper reminds me of something very important. Never, ever use a file or sandpaper on a shaper because it'll distort the shape. This particular fold-over shaper, it's really unfortunate because I think the shape is actually pretty terrific, but the previous owner almost destroyed it. Over time, the file and the sandpaper have altered the shape a little bit, and it's hard to use. When you fold the cane over the shape, and you have to obviously, so you've profiled the cane, and you fold it over, and you want to center the cane exactly so that the thickest part of the profile is right in the middle of the shape, and you can look at the cane through some light and line it up. You want to push it down right as far down onto the tip as possible, and if it's too far up, if it's inconsistently placed in the shaper, then it's going to be an inconsistent product, which is going to be confusing when you're making it. You're not going to know what variable is what. And then you just slide these clamps up on the shape. I'm not actually using proper cane here. And you clamp it down. This is the piece of shape cane I just profiled. So this is just a demonstration. And you clamp it down. Now when you're, the same principle applies when you're shaping. You carve down to the middle of the shape, and then you carve up. And try to carve both sides at the same time. If you tilt this at an angle, you're going to start carving beyond where the shape is guiding your blade. So try to carve both sides of cane at the same time, and then if you have to clean it up, you can tip it a little bit. But don't go, as you're carving down, don't go beyond the middle point of the shape, and as you're carving up, don't go beyond the middle point of the shape. And that's that. And then you're ready to make a blank, but you have wonderful cane that has been selected, gouged properly. You're not going to worry that if you don't try to make a reed out of this piece of cane, you'll be wasting $3, $5, however much it is now to buy processed cane. You're just going to be wasting a few pennies, and you can put it aside and not shed a single tear for that horrible piece of cane that would otherwise have tortured you. Good luck.